The fluorescent lights in Gerald Morrow's office hummed with the kind of quiet that only exists when bad news is about to be spoken aloud. Dale Whitaker sat across from the banker in a plastic chair that was just slightly too hard. His worn Carhartt jacket folded across his knees, his hands calloused, cracked at the knuckles, the color of old saddle leather. Resting flat on the edge of the desk, as if bracing for impact, Gerald didn't look up right away. He flipped through the folder slowly, methodically, the way a doctor examines a chart before delivering a diagnosis he's already made. The First National Bank of Creston County had been lending to the Whitaker family for 41 years. Gerald himself had approved Dale's last 3 operating loans. But this morning, the numbers on the pages in front of him told a story that no amount of loyalty could rewrite. Outside, the town of Millhaven, Kansas, was just waking up. A grain truck rumbled past the bank window. The hardware store across the street was flipping its sign to open. It was March, the kind of raw, colorless March where the fields sit empty and brown, and the sky is the same flat gray as old concrete, and it looked exactly like how Dale felt. Gerald finally set down his pen and folded his hands. He was a decent man, Dale knew that. He wasn't doing this with pleasure. "Dale," he said, his voice careful and measured, "I've looked at this from every angle I can find." He paused. At this point, we're not talking about growth anymore. We're talking about survival. The words landed like a fence post driven into frozen ground. Dale didn't respond immediately. He looked at a framed photograph on the wall behind Gerald. A pastoral landscape, green fields rolling toward a sunset, the kind of image designed to suggest prosperity and abundance. He almost laughed. "You're saying no," Dale said. "I'm saying the collateral position is compromised. Your debt-to-asset ratio is well outside our threshold. The last 2 crop years." "I know what the last 2 crop years were," Dale said quietly. "I lived them." Gerald nodded. He had the decency not to look away. "I'm sorry, Dale. I truly am." Dale drove home in silence. The radio stayed off. He passed Hendrix's place, the old Brower operation. Then the section corners he'd memorized since childhood. When he pulled into his own driveway and looked out at his fields, 200 acres of tired Kansas ground. He sat in the truck for a long time before going inside. 3 years later, that same banker would watch him sign papers for something. Nobody in this county thought Dale Whitaker would ever own. The Whitaker farm didn't start with Dale. It started with his grandfather, Eldon, who homesteaded 320 acres west of Millhaven in 1931, which, by any measure, was about the worst possible time to start a farm in Kansas. But Eldon Whitaker was the kind of man who confused stubbornness with faith, and he'd managed to hold on through the Dust Bowl, through the Depression, through 2 droughts that turned neighbors into refugees headed for California with everything they owned piled in the backs of trucks. Eldon had passed the land to Dale's father, Raymond, who expanded it to 800 acres in the 1960s and 70s when good grain prices and affordable credit made growth feel not just possible, but inevitable. Raymond planted wheat and corn and milo, raised a few beef cattle on the creek ground, and sent Dale to K-State for 2 years. Before the operation got big enough that Dale was needed back home full-time. That was 1985. Dale was 22 years old. He came home and never left. He took over the full operation in 1994 when Raymond's knees gave out and the doctor found the shadow on his lung that would eventually take him in 19. By then, Dale had married Patricia, a farm girl from Reno County who could drive a grain truck, keep the books, raise 2 kids, still have supper on the table by 6. They bought the Kellner Quarter section in 2003, expanded to 1,200 acres, took on a reasonable equipment loan for a new combine, and for about 8 years, from roughly 2005 to 2013, things were genuinely, measurably good. Good years in farming are dangerous in ways that bad years aren't. Bad years teach you something. Good years make you forget. Dale expanded his input budget during those years, upgraded to larger equipment, rented an additional 400 acres that he couldn't really afford to farm at thin margins. He did what nearly every farmer in the county did. He grew the operation when the money was there, assuming the money would keep being there. Then 2012 happened. Drought. Real drought. The kind where the corn curls up on itself by July, and the milo never tassels right, and you drive past your fields in August and feel a hollow place open up in your chest that's hard to describe to anyone who hasn't farmed. The county averaged less than 14 inches of precipitation that year. Dale's operation was down 60% from normal yields. He absorbed it. He had some crop insurance. He tightened down and carried the debt. 2013 was dry, too. And 2014 came in wet enough in the spring that he planted optimistically, only to have a July heat event and no rain through pollination. Corn prices had also started sliding as South American production expanded. His break even on corn was $4 a bushel. He was selling at $3.70. By 2015, Dale had refinanced the equipment loan twice. He'd borrowed against the farm to cover operating losses. Patricia had gone back to work part-time at the cooperative extension office in town. Their son Travis, 24, and working in Wichita, had offered to send money home. That conversation, held at the kitchen table on a January night, with the wind howling outside, was one of the hardest Dale had endured. "We're not taking money from our children," Patricia had said, and Dale had agreed, but not before he'd had to leave the room for a few minutes. The equipment was aging. The John Deere 4070R they'd been running since 2012 had 400 hours on it and was starting to show it. A hydraulic leak that kept reappearing, a sensor issue in the planting monitor that the dealer couldn't seem to fix permanently. The combine needed a new feeder house, which the dealer quoted at $23,000. Dale paid $8,000 for a used one from an auction in Nebraska and had Travis help him install it over a long weekend in November. In 2016, a late spring ice storm damaged 400 acres of his winter wheat just before heading. The insurance adjuster came out, walked the fields, and settled the claim at 60 cents on the dollar. Dale didn't have the energy to argue. The operating loan he'd carried for years, used each spring to buy seed, fertilizer, and fuel, then repaid after harvest, had grown from $180, to $380,000. The bank had renewed it each year, but each year the renewal conversation had gotten longer and more serious. Gerald Morrow had started asking for updated financial statements twice a year. He'd started asking Dale about his marketing plan, his input budget, his contingency reserves. By the time Dale sat in that plastic chair in March of 2017, he had no contingency reserves. He had a debt-to-asset ratio that made Gerald wince. He had a farm that was, by every financial metric the bank used, on the wrong side of viable, and he had neighbors who were watching. Bill Hendricks farmed the ground to the north. He was 10 years younger than Dale, had a newer operation, and had taken on a custom farming arrangement with a large investment group that essentially paid him to farm land he didn't own. He'd been expanding steadily. He was not unkind about Dale's situation, but at the co-op coffee table on Tuesday mornings, he was honest with the other farmers. Whitaker's going to have a hard time getting through this one. Tom Carver, who farmed to the east and was the most respected agricultural voice in the county, had stopped by Dale's place in late February, ostensibly to return a borrowed auger. He'd stayed for coffee and said carefully, "If you ever need to talk about your options, all your options, I'm here." Dale understood what he meant. Carver was offering to help him think through selling. Everyone thought he was going to lose it. Not out of malice, simply because the numbers said so. Dale spent 3 days after leaving the bank doing something unusual for a farmer in crisis. He read. He pulled out every USDA soil report ever done on his ground, some going back to the 1970s. He drove to the county extension office, where Patricia worked, and sat with Jim Aldrich, the extension agronomist, for 2 hours one afternoon, asking questions he'd never thought to ask before. He ordered 2 books online, one on regenerative agriculture and one on direct market grain sales, and he read them both cover to cover, Patricia noted, because in 30 years of marriage, she'd never seen him read anything cover to cover except the farm, bill, summary, and the combine operator's manual. He also drove out to visit Harold Stemper. Harold was 81 years old and had retired from farming in 2001 after 53 years on the same ground his own father had broken. He lived in a small house at the edge of Millhaven with a garden bigger than most, people's lawns, and an opinion on almost everything. Dale had known Harold since childhood. Harold had known Eldon Whitaker. He was one of those men who carries agricultural knowledge the way old fence posts carry weather, deep in the grain of the thing. Dale sat at Harold's kitchen table for 3 hours one evening in late March. He told Harold everything, the debt, the yields, the bank, all of it. Harold listened without interrupting, which was how you knew he was taking it seriously. When Dale finished, Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Dale would turn over in his mind for years afterward. Your grandfather farmed that ground for 30 years before he ever bought a bag of commercial fertilizer. Not because he was poor, though he was, but because he didn't know he needed it yet. The ground fed itself. Then we taught it to be dependent. He paused. You've been farming those fields like they're a factory. What if you farmed them like they were sick and needed to get well? Dale drove home in the dark thinking about that. What he decided over the following 2 weeks was not dramatic. It wasn't a single revelation or a genius pivot. It was in some ways embarrassingly simple. He was going to stop trying to farm like a large operation and start farming like a careful one. He was going to reduce his rented acres, give back the 400-acre lease he'd been losing money on, and focus intensively on the 200 acres he owned. He was going to slash his input costs, rebuild his soil health, eliminate unnecessary overhead, and find at least one additional income stream that didn't depend on commodity prices. He also called Gerald Morrow and proposed something the banker wasn't expecting. Instead of a new operating loan, Dale asked for a restructured term loan at a lower amount, using his owned land as collateral. With a 5-year repayment schedule, he walked in with a written business plan. 12 pages, typed by Patricia, that outlined exactly what he intended to do and how. Gerald studied it. He was skeptical. But it was a better proposal than liquidation, and Gerald had enough banking sense to know that a forced sale in a down market wouldn't recover the debt anyway. I'll take it to the committee, he said. But, Dale, this plan has to work. We won't have another conversation like this one. The loan was restructured. It was less money than Dale needed, and more pressure than he'd ever felt. He gave up the rental ground, which meant Bill Hendricks and another neighbor quietly divided it between them, and he came home that spring with a budget so tight it made Patricia set her jaw in the way she did when she was determined not to show worry. Nobody thought it would work. The spring of 2017 was cold and late. Dale planted his wheat acres in winter wheat as planned, but he cut his corn acres by 40% and seeded the rest of that ground into a summer cover mix, a blend of legumes and brassicas that he'd researched and ordered from a specialty seed company in Oklahoma. The neighbors drove by and looked. A few of them slowed down. Bill Hendricks stopped his pickup at the road's edge one morning in May and watched Dale running the drill through the field with what was obviously not corn seed. Cover crops? Hendricks called out when Dale came near the fence line. Building organic matter, Dale said. Hendricks nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's being polite about something he thinks is foolish. You're leaving that ground idle in a production year. I'm investing in it, Dale said, and kept going. He also started offering custom combining work to smaller operators in the county who didn't have their own harvesting equipment. He had the combine, he had the hours, and he could charge $28 per acre for custom work. By harvest that fall, he'd done custom work on 4 farms and brought in $31,000 in service revenue that had nothing to do with commodity prices. The wheat crop came in at 48 bushels per acre. Not exceptional, but solid. His corn acres, reduced as they were, averaged 162 bushels, slightly better than the county average because he'd concentrated his inputs on fewer acres. He paid November's loan installment. He and Patricia went out to dinner at the Mexican place in Millhaven to celebrate, which Patricia later told her. Sister was the first time they'd gone out to a restaurant for something other than a funeral or a birthday in 2 years. That December, Dale drove out to Harold Stemper's place with a bottle of bourbon and told him about the year. Harold listened and nodded. "You'll see it in the soil in another year," Harold said. "These things don't happen fast." "I know," Dale said. "Do you know? Or are you just saying it?" Dale thought about it honestly. "A little of both." Harold laughed, which was a good sound. The spring of 2018 brought adequate moisture. Not abundant, but workable. Dale applied his fertilizer program based on updated soil tests he'd pulled himself that winter. A grid-sampled approach that Jim Aldrich at the Extension Office had helped him design. What the tests revealed surprised him. Several fields had severe phosphorus imbalances and low organic matter that he'd been trying to compensate for with higher nitrogen rates. He'd been putting nitrogen on ground that needed something else. He adjusted. He expanded his cover crop acres. He also made a decision that surprised people even more than the cover crops. He leased 20 beef cows from a neighbor who was partially retiring and ran them on his cover crop fields and on a creek pasture he'd been underutilizing. The cows grazed the covers down, added organic matter through manure, and generated some lease income. It also meant Dale was out checking fence and moving cattle, which Patricia said was the first 3 years. She'd seen him smiling when he came in from the fields. The custom work expanded. He picked up contracts with 7 operators that year. He bought a used grain cart at an auction for $14,000, which stretched the budget significantly. But it allowed him to offer a more complete harvest package that justified a higher per-acre rate. In June, a severe hailstorm tracked through the northern part of the county and destroyed Hendrick's best corn ground. 600 acres of what had been a beautiful crop reduced to shredded stalks overnight. Dale drove over the next morning and found Hendrick standing at the field edge, looking like a man who'd been gut-punched. He said nothing for a moment, then offered Hendricks the use of his grain cart for the season at no charge. Hendricks looked at him. "You don't need to do that." "I know," Dale said. "I'm doing it anyway." That fall, Dale's corn averaged 174 bushels. His wheat was 52 bushels. The soil tests he pulled after harvest showed a measurable increase in organic matter in the cover crop fields. Small but real. Jim Aldrich drove out in October and walked the fields with Dale, and partway through, the agronomist stopped and looked at the soil profile he'd just dug and said, "This is actually different from what I saw 2 years ago." "I know," Dale said, and tried not to sound too pleased about it. The November loan payment came and went. The December payment too. Dale's debt-to-asset ratio, which Gerald Morrow reviewed as part of the loan conditions, had improved by 6 percentage points. Gerald sent a brief note with the payment confirmation, Good progress. Keep it up. The spring of 2019 arrived early and warm. For the first time in several years, Dale Whitaker planted his fields with something approaching confidence, not certainty. Farming never gives you certainty, but the kind of quiet confidence that comes from having done the work and watched it take hold. He made one significant equipment investment that spring. A used variable rate planter controller he found through a precision ag dealer in Salina cost $8,400. Money he'd set aside from the custom work revenue, and it allowed him to vary his seeding rates across his fields based on the yield maps he'd been building for 2 years. He spent a weekend in February programming it with Jim Aldrich's help. On the first day he ran it, he called Patricia on the radio, just to say that he could actually feel the difference, which she said didn't make sense because precision planting doesn't have a feel, and he said she was wrong, that it felt like the farm was finally doing what it was supposed to do. That summer, Dale added a small direct market grain contract. A regional flour mill 80 miles away was looking for identity-preserved wheat, specific varieties grown under documented protocols, and was willing to pay a premium of 35 cents per bushel above the board price. Dale grew 300 acres of the designated variety, maintained the documentation, and delivered it in August. The premium added $8,400 to his wheat revenue on that segment alone. By harvest, his corn averaged 189 bushels per acre. His wheat was 56 bushels on the identity-preserved ground, and 49 on the remainder. His custom work had grown to 11 farms. His cattle lease had become a cash grazing arrangement that generated $14,000 over the season. In September, Patricia sat down with the books and called Dale in from the shop where he was winterizing the combine. He came in with grease on his hands and sat at the kitchen table while she walked him through the numbers. For the first time in 6 years, the operation was cash flow positive. Not dramatically so, not enough to retire on. But the debt was shrinking, the soil was improving, the income was diversified, and the farm that Gerald Morrow's bank had essentially written off 3 years earlier was, by every measurable metric, trending in the right direction. Dale sat at that table for a long time after Patricia went back to the kitchen. He looked at the numbers. He looked at the window, at the darkening fields outside. He thought about his grandfather, Eldon, sitting on that same land in 1931, choosing to stay when everyone was leaving. He allowed himself very quietly to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Word travels in farming communities the way water finds low ground. Quietly, indirectly, until suddenly it's everywhere. It started with the custom work. When you're running a combine on 11 different farms in a county, people see your work up close. They see how the machine's adjusted, how the grain loss is managed, how the operator handles the headlands. Dale's reputation for careful, thorough custom combining grew without him promoting it. By fall of 2019, he had farmers calling him in August to get on his harvest schedule. Tom Carver The man who'd once gently suggested Dale consider selling stopped at a field day put on by the extension office in October and stood next to Dale while Jim Aldrich presented soil health data from 3 county farms. One of those farms was Dale's. The organic matter numbers, the infiltration rates, the yield trends, they were the strongest of the 3. Carver said nothing during the presentation. Afterward, walking back to the parking area, he said to Dale, "I'll be honest with you, I thought you were done 3 years ago." "I know," Dale said. "What changed?" Dale thought about Harold Stemper, about his grandfather, about the soil tests, and the cover crops, and the long winters of reading things he'd never thought to read before. "I stopped farming the way I thought I was supposed to, and started farming the way my ground actually needed," he said. Carver nodded slowly. "That's harder than it sounds." "Yes," Dale said, "it is." Bill Hendricks, for his part, had become quietly respectful in a way he hadn't been before the hailstorm. Before Dale had shown up the next morning, with an offer of help, rather, a survey of the damage. They weren't close friends, exactly. But they'd developed the kind of cordial regard that farming neighbors develop when they've seen each other in difficulty and behaved decently. Gerald Morrow reviewed Dale's financials for the scheduled annual review in November 2019, sat across from him in that same office, in front of the same pastoral photograph on the wall, and said something he hadn't said in several years. "Dale, I want you to know what you've done here is unusual. It doesn't often go this direction." Meaning most operations in your position in 2017 ended up in liquidation within 2 years. You didn't, and it's not luck. I can see that in the numbers. Dale thanked him. He drove home with the windows down, despite the November cold, because he needed the air on his face. Dale heard about the Reinhardt farm from Harold Stemper, of all people. Wayne Reinhardt had farmed the 800 acres immediately south of Dale's property for 40 years. He was 73, a widower with no children interested in farming. He'd been quietly considering his options for 2 years. And in the fall of 2019, he'd made a decision. He was going to sell. The land would go on the market in January. Harold told Dale about it on a Thursday evening in November. Dale sat with the information for 2 days before saying anything to Patricia. The Reinhardt ground was exceptional. Deep, level ground with a good mix of upland corn acres and some of the best dryland wheat soils in the county. Dale had farmed next to it for 20 years and had coveted it. Not covetously, not bitterly, but in the way farmers look at good land and feel a kind of gravitational pull. It was, by any reasonable assessment, priced well beyond what he could have considered even a year ago. He told Patricia on a Saturday morning over coffee. She was quiet for a moment. "What would we need?" "It'll go for somewhere between $4,500 and $5,200 an acre. 800 acres. He let the math sit. She nodded. She was doing it too. "What do we have?" she asked. "If we refinance the operation on current values, and our values have recovered some, and if Gerald is willing to look at this differently than he would have." 3 years ago, we might be able to structure a land loan for the acquisition. He paused. Might. Have you talked to Gerald? Not yet. Talk to Gerald, she said, and refilled his coffee. There were other interested parties. Dale knew this. He'd heard through various channels that Bill Hendricks had already reached out to the listing agent. There was talk of an investment group out of Kansas City that had been acquiring farmland in the region. Wayne Reinhardt's asking price was firm. He'd been advised by his attorney to hold it there. Dale called Jim Aldrich and asked him to do an independent assessment of the Reinhardt ground's productive potential. He drove every field boundary himself, on foot in December, in weather that was cold enough to numb his hands through his gloves. He pulled soil cores from 3 locations and sent them to the state lab. He was building a file, not just for himself, but for the bank, because the bank was always part of it. That was the reality of farming. The land wasn't just a dream. It was a financial instrument, a balance sheet entry, a risk calculation. If Dale was going to walk into Gerald Morrow's office and ask for a land loan significant enough to purchase the Reinhardt farm, he needed numbers that justified it. He spent 3 weeks building the proposal. Patricia helped him build the financial projections. Jim Aldrich provided a letter attesting to the soil, quality, and productive capacity of the Reinhardt ground. Dale included 3 years of his own farm's financial statements, his yield records, his custom work income documentation. He included a 5-year cash flow projection that showed, conservatively, how the additional 800 acres could be integrated into the existing operation. He scheduled the meeting with Gerald for January 14th, 2020. The night before the meeting, Dale couldn't sleep. He got up at 2 a.m., sat at the kitchen table, in the dark, not doing anything particular, just sitting with it. Patricia came down an hour later and sat across from him. "Are you scared?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. "That means it matters." She went back to bed. He sat for another hour, then went to the shop and checked the tire pressure on the grain cart, because there was nothing else useful he could do at 3 in the morning. And at least that was something. The fluorescent lights in Gerald Morrow's office hummed exactly as they had on that March morning 3 years earlier. The plastic chair was the same. The framed pastoral photographs was still on the wall behind the desk. But the folder Gerald was reviewing was very different from the last one. The man sitting in the chair across from him was different too, not in obvious ways. Dale still wore the Carhartt jacket, still had the same hands, still had the same quiet, direct manner. But he sat in the chair like a man who knew what he'd done and could account for every step of it. Gerald took his time. Dale let him take it, finally. Gerald looked up. "I've reviewed everything you submitted," he said. "The financial statements, the yield data, the projections, the agronomist's letter." He paused. "I also pulled our internal files on your operation going back to 2017. Dale nodded. 3 years ago, this bank did not believe your operation was viable at its current scale. Gerald said, "I want to be straightforward about that. We were prepared to work with you through a liquidation process. He held Dale's eyes. "We were wrong." Dale didn't say anything. "What you've done in 3 years is, and I don't use this word lightly in banking, remarkable. You've reduced your debt by 38%. You've improved your cash flow from significantly negative to consistently positive. You've diversified your income in ways that show real risk management. And the soil health data your agronomist provided indicates that your productive capacity is actually higher today than it was when we last discussed your operation comprehensively." Gerald set down the folder. "This is a different farm." "Same ground," Dale said. "Different approach." Gerald almost smiled. "The loan committee reviewed your proposal on Tuesday. The Reinhardt acquisition, as you've structured it, is within our lending parameters given your current financial position." He slid a packet of documents across the desk. "There are conditions. Standard LTV requirements, a personal guarantee, and we'll want updated appraisals on your existing collateral before closing." "But the answer, Dale, is yes." Dale looked at the packet. He looked at Gerald. He thought about all the things he could say in this moment. The sleepless nights, the tight Decembers, the years of hauling silage in the dark after full days of field work, the conversation at the kitchen table when Travis had offered to send money home and Dale had had to leave the room. He thought about his grandfather Eldon in the worst years of the Dust Bowl, choosing to stay. He thought about Harold Stemper saying, "What if you farmed them like they were sick and needed to get well?" "Thank you, Gerald," Dale said. He signed the papers on February 3rd, 2020. The closing took place at a title company in Millhaven, with Wayne Reinhardt and his attorney across the table, and Patricia sitting next to Dale and Gerald Morrow sitting at the end, present as the bank representative, but clearly there as something more than that. Clearly there as a witness to something he hadn't expected to see. Wayne Reinhardt shook Dale's hand afterward and held it for a moment. He was a tall, deliberate man, and he looked at Dale the way an older farmer looks at a younger one when something important is passing between them. "You'll take care of it," Reinhardt said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Dale said, "I will." 2 days after the closing, on a cold February afternoon, with thin clouds dragging across a pale blue sky, Dale drove the south section road that ran between his existing ground and what was now officially also his. He stopped at the fence line that had separated the two properties for the entirety of his farming life. The same fence he'd walked alongside as a child, a teenager, a young farmer, a struggling farmer, a farmer who'd been told he was finished. He got out of the truck and stood at the wire. To the north, his ground. When 200 acres, he knew the way. He knew his own hands. Every low spot, every gravel outcrop, every field that ran wet in spring, every corner that dried out first in July. Ground his grandfather had broken, and his father had built, and he had nearly lost and had instead, slowly, stubbornly, without luck and without shortcuts, rebuilt into something that worked again. To the south, the Reinhardt ground. 800 acres of deep, black prairie soil, still dormant in the February cold, dusted here and there with the remnants of last fall's wheat stubble. ground that would need to be understood, mapped, tested, worked into the rotation, introduced to his management philosophy, ground that had its own history, its own tendencies, its own needs. 2,000 acres. He stood at that fence line for a long time. The wind came up from the southwest, the way it always does in Kansas in February, carrying a faint smell of dust and dry grass. It was cold enough that he turned the collar of his jacket up and pulled his cap lower over his ears. A meadowlark, early, probably pushed north by a warm spell, called from somewhere in the Reinhardt stubble. One clear, liquid note, then another. He thought about what had brought him here. Not the good fortune. There hadn't been any particular good fortune. Not the ideal weather. The weather had been what Kansas weather always was, which is to say unpredictable and often unkind. Not any single brilliant idea or lucky market move or bailout from an unexpected source. What had brought him here was 3 years of quiet decisions, made carefully and kept. Cover crops planted in fields that could have grown revenue crops, custom work taken in evenings and weekends when he was already exhausted. Soil tests ordered when spending money felt dangerous. Cows grazed on cover crop fields by a man who had never been a cattle farmer, learning as he went. A direct market contract negotiated over the phone in his kitchen. Reading from a notepad he'd spent 2 weeks filling. The offer of a free grain cart to a neighbor after a hailstorm, which had cost him nothing except the gesture, and had been worth everything in terms of who he was and how the county understood him. Discipline over impulse, patience over shortcuts, the long view over the quarterly calculation. Underneath all of it, bedrock, the thing that had held when everything else was under pressure, the belief that the ground was worth saving, that the work was worth doing, that a farm wasn't a financial vehicle or a production unit or a balance sheet entry, but a living thing, a relationship between a family and a piece of earth that spanned generations and deserved to be taken seriously. His grandfather had believed that. His father had believed that. And, standing at that fence line in the February cold, looking south across 800 acres of good Kansas ground that was now his to steward, Dale Whitaker believed it too. He reached out and put his hand on the top wire of the fence. The metal was cold and slightly rough with rust. He held it for a moment, then let go. He got back in the truck. He had work to do. 3 years earlier, the bank had told him his farm was finished. Standing there at sunset, looking across the land he'd just bought, he realized they had only seen the end of one chapter, not the beginning of the next.